Now, on 3AW Great Australian Lives for Tobin Brothers Funerals, celebrating lives.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Jo Hall and it's my great pleasure to bring you another inspiring edition of Great Australian Lives on 3AW. Great Australian Lives celebrates some remarkable Australians who've left a long-lasting impression on us. Whether they're renowned icons or everyday Aussies, each week I'll be joined by a special guest and together we'll look back over their life, where they've come from, where they are now and perhaps where they're going. It's all about Great Australian Lives for Tobin Brothers Funerals, celebrating lives every day of the year. For tonight's program, I'm joined by a mountaineer who scaled large heights. His thirst for adventure pushed him to become the first Australian, alongside Greg Mortimer, to reach the peak of Mount Everest. But he would later go one better, ascending the world's tallest mountain from sea level to summit. It's my great pleasure to welcome our very special guest tonight, Tim Macartney-Snape. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
What a monumental accomplishment. When you look back on reaching the summit of Everest, what do you feel?
Oh, well, I just feel that magical moment when I finally, all the hard work was over and I stepped onto the summit in the amazing rosy pink glow of the sunset. A bit of a scary time to be there, but visually it was an amazing experience.
Why was it scary at that time?
Well, it means you've got no more light imminently because it gets dark very quickly in the lower latitudes, and then you're faced with a descent in the dark, which probably the descent's hazardous enough without being dark as well.
Let's go back to when you first developed your passion for adventure. You were born in Tanzania, is that right, on a farm?
Yep, Tanganyika as it was then.
Mm-hmm. You're Australian father and Irish mother.
Yep.
It's a pretty unique makeup.
Yeah, my dad, actually I'm a generation out of place. My father was born in 1896. He fought in the First World War, nearly didn't make it. Was repatriated with a severe chest wound, had a bit of shrapnel go right through his chest, lost a rib. If he hadn't been next to a first aid post, he probably would have died because they managed to stem the blood flow because his aorta was cut. Anyway, he recovered from that, and I guess the experience gave him a bit of a wanderlust. And in the 20s, he went out to Africa, got with a mate, gold prospecting, didn't catch the bug like his mate did and took up farming instead. He came from a rural background and farmed there in Tanganyika, as it was then. Then had a stint back in... he actually married an English woman. She didn't like Africa that much, so they went to Ireland to try and patch up the marriage, but it didn't work. Then he met my mother, took her back to Africa, and that's where my sisters and I were born.
So how many sisters do you have? 3 sisters. What are your memories of life on the farm?
Oh, it was a magical upbringing, free and wild, and the social life wasn't that great, but I had a few. Obviously on the farm we had a few local people working. And so I was playing with their kids, African kids, and didn't go to school until I was 8. And that was a boarding school, which was a bit of a bummer, but still an interesting experience. And that probably, I think I always had a latency to be a mountaineer, but my school was in the north of Tanzania. We lived in the south, and through the windows of my classroom I could look at this nearly 5,000 metre volcano called Mount Meru, and sometimes it had snow on top of it, but I'd always dream about what the view would be like from the top. Never got the opportunity. Not far away was Mount Kilimanjaro. Likewise, I was had a dream of doing that, but then due to the political instabilities of the mid to late 60s, my parents decided to move to Australia. It was just getting too difficult.
Why Australia?
Because my father was Australian, we had relatives here, and it was obviously a better option than going to the British Isles.
How did you feel about the move?
I was devastated. It was probably the hardest thing that ever happened to me, really. I was just heartbroken leaving, my home, and I went into deep mourning, really. Australia's a great place, but it's not Africa.
It is hard to. I moved when I was 9 as well, just suburbs, but it's difficult if you're very happy where you are, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's heart-wrenching.
Now, you attended Geelong Grammar.
Yeah, my father was sent there back when it was still in actual Geelong rather than Corio. And so when I was born, I was put down. One of my great-grandfathers was a founder of the school, so I guess there's a family connection there. But I think I felt very lucky to have gone there because of Timbertop. So James Darling, who was the school's longest-serving headmaster, had a stroke of genius in deciding to set up this outdoor campus for 15-year-olds because, it was deemed to be a bit of a troublesome time. And so eventually found this property on the slopes of, near Mount Buller in the Victorian Alps and set up this campus to much opposition from parents. But, one of the things I lament about modern education is it no longer seems to be taking a role of leadership. Whereas Jim Darling or St James Darling, he was a true leader, and he basically just, overrode any opposition and said, no, this is what we're doing because it will be, I'm responsible for your sons, not you, and you've entrusted me with that job, so this is what I think is good for them. And it's just an amazing experience for a 15-year-old. Now, they've dropped it a year because it's co-ed, but for people of that age to have a year in a situation where you have to take responsibility for, everything that goes on around you, basically, and you're given the opportunity to go out on weekends on hikes, and you have to look after yourself, you have to find your way, and so just to be given that trust is wonderful. I mean, you make a lot of mistakes, of course. That's a good way of learning.
Is that where you got your love of the outdoors?
Well, again, I think it was always latent in me. Just growing up where I did, I always loved the outdoors, but it certainly gave me the opportunity to put it into practice, and I learned a lot about how to survive in the outdoors, and certainly it was the beginning of a lifelong passion for anything in the outdoors.
So when you go to uni and you study for your Bachelor of Science, you joined the mountaineering club there. What did you do when you were in that club?
Well, when you go to uni, most people attend a sort of orientation week, and all these clubs and societies are trying to get you to join up to get your membership fee. And I just saw this, the mountaineering club had a stand and a few photos of people climbing on something I always wanted to try. I mean, I climbed trees since I could walk, so rock climbing seemed like a natural extension. And the club basically organised rock climbing outings and nearby cliffs, and during the summer people in the club would go off to New Zealand and do mountaineering courses and then do private trips. So I just fell into that, and eventually it's how I got to go to the Himalaya, because the club was organising, I think it was probably one of the first expeditions out of Australia to actually go and climb a serious peak in that part of the world.
In 1978 you travelled to India as part of a mountaineering expedition, one of the highest peaks of the Himalayas, and it was a dangerous trek. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, it was. We were a group of novices. Back then, it was hard to find out information, but we decided on this peak. It was a high peak, over 7,000 metres, and really we bit off a lot more than we could chew. To cut a long story short, but luckily, none of us were killed. I got to the summit. My climbing partner suffered frostbite. And lost a few joints on his left foot, on his toe. But
had that been climbed before?
It had been, but not that often. And I mean, it was the first major peak that Australians had climbed, and it was a tremendous learning experience for me. It was the start of a lifelong love affair with the Himalaya.
Climbing, is it Amma Dablam in Nepal?
Yeah.
That's a 6,800 metre peak in 81. That inspired you to tackle Everest, did it?
Yeah, well, see, Amma Dablam is a very, very beautiful mountain in the Everest region, and a friend of mine got permission from the Nepalese government, just opened it up again, because they weren't issuing permits for that mountain for a long time, ever since actually the kind of New Zealand-led international expedition made the first ascent, and it wasn't actually sanctioned by the government, so the government closed it off. There was an expedition that was led by Ed Hillary, actually, although he didn't do the climb. But so when it opened up in the 1980 or something like that, a friend of mine got a permit and invited us to go along, and whilst on Amma Dablam, a beautiful climb up the North Ridge, quite difficult. I could see Everest all the time. And up until that point, I thought, well, I'm not really an Everest climber, because that's sort of, I actually wasn't that interested, because it required a lot of logistics back then to do an Everest expedition. A lot of high altitude porters, the Sherpas, oxygen, etc., etc. But looking at Everest, I couldn't help wondering what it was like up there. What would it be like? And I thought, well, it'd be very cool if. And it's just daydreaming. Australians climbed it and did it in good style, which meant lightweight, not using oxygen, without Sherpa guides. And I thought it'd be even better, if you did it in that style and climbed a new route. But obviously, it's just a pipe dream. But that sort of sowed a seed in my mind. And later that year, I happened to meet a Japanese guy who had just been on the north side of Everest, because that had only been opened up recently by the Chinese government. And he told me about the north side of the mountain. He said the north face is very direct. And I thought, well, yeah, that when he showed me a photo, it made sense. And I thought, that is a possibility there to do an alpine-style ascent, on that face, a way no one's ever climbed it before. And then another lucky chance was I happened to go to China shortly afterwards and found out from the Chinese that there was a space available on Everest in 3 years' time. So I decided to bite the bullet and apply for it, and got the permit. So all of a sudden found myself and my friends organising an Australian Everest expedition with minimal experience. So because we had 3 years to plan, we could get a little bit more experience under our belt.
Did anyone try and talk you out of it?
Well, eventually we managed to, I don't know, we must have been good at talking, to convince Sam Chisholm at Channel 9 to back us. And they interviewed Ed Hillary when he was passing through Sydney, as he did quite frequently. They managed to interview him, and he said, they asked him what he thought our chances were, and he said, well, no one's ever climbed a new route on Everest before, and so I don't think their chances are that good. But I guess there were people who, most people were rightly sceptical. But, if you're really determined.
And you are. I'm Jo Hall, and my special guest tonight is mountaineer thrill seeker Tim Macartney-Snape. You're listening to Great Australian Lives for Tobin Brothers Funerals, proudly Australian owned and serving Victorian families for more than 80 years. Tobin Brothers Funerals celebrates Great Australian Lives. Welcome back to Great Australian Lives. I'm Jo Hall, and my special guest tonight is mountaineer Tim Macartney-Snape. Tim, you spoke a bit before about the logistics of Everest, and obviously there is so much involved in that. What was your preparation like?
Well, because we were hoping to go lightweight, the preparation was less than it would otherwise have been. The main preparation is actually psychological and also economic, I guess, financial. It was extremely difficult in the early stages getting funding, because we couldn't afford to do it ourselves as we were going through China.
How much does it cost?
The Chinese gave us a budget of about $100,000, and then we worked out that if we were, the best way of actually getting funding would probably be to make a documentary. So that bumped the budget up to 150, maybe 200,000, which back in the early 80s was a lot of money. And so, there was a time. There were times when it seemed like we, just weren't going to be able to do it. The problem is, of course, it doesn't actually. The actual cost of doing it is not that much, but the Chinese charge a premium. And for instance, we learnt from when you get to base camp, you can approach the mountain another 10 kilometres from base camp by just walking up to an advanced base camp. And we plan to spend most of our time up there to take all our food for maybe 5 weeks and fuel up there, which is a lot of stuff for 5 people plus a film crew. So we needed help from the local people, and they had yaks. So they were getting paid by the Chinese government $2 per yak per day, and the Chinese were charging us $50. And then that goes right through your journey through China. They were just charging the absolute premium. And so that's what makes it very expensive. But when I say psychological preparation, it's critical to any difficult endeavour to invest a lot of thinking into, and when I say thinking about the task ahead in a creative and inspired way, so that you are kind of trying to live the experience in your brain beforehand. And when you do that, you all sorts of ideas come up about preparation. So then that covers your physical fitness. You think, I better go and do this to get a bit more experience in this, that included climbing other mountains, high mountains, because we've only been, actually the only one who'd been above 7,000 metres at that stage. So we needed to get more experience at altitude, and you're also thinking about equipment, what equipment you might need. So, all of that, all of the logistical planning comes after your psychological planning that you're going through, the process in your mind. And by doing that, it really makes, when you actually get there, not only are you, prepared in a logistical sense, but psychologically you are prepared because you kind of already done the journey. And, it's still the hard part to come, of course, when you actually, got to put one foot in front of the other. But it does give you that momentum to push through difficult.
What about your fitness and diet?
Yeah, of course, that's all important. That if your head's in the right place, then you automatically get, take care of all that. So, yeah, diet. I think I'm mainly a vegetarian. I just eat a little bit of meat. Back then, we because meat's difficult to transport and preserve and all that sort of stuff without having other chemicals involved. We're basically a vegetarian expedition, and we had good food on the trip. But beforehand, of course, make sure you eat healthily and just keep exercising. I always think, people say, "Oh, how do you train?" I said, I don't really like the word training, because to me, keeping fit is about enjoying what you're doing. So my tip for people to stay fit or get fit is to find a physical activity that you actually enjoy doing, not something that bores you to death. So find a physical activity that you enjoy doing, and you'll stay fit automatically, because you just want to get out there and have fun.
The ascent took nearly 2 months to achieve. What challenges did you have to overcome?
Well, the first challenge, of course, is to acclimatise. And in the case of the north side of Everest, that's more of a challenge than normal, because you actually drive to base camp. The Chinese built a road there when they made their first attempt in the late 1950s. And so you don't get much of a chance to acclimatise. So you've got to be very, very patient and just take it easy for the first couple of weeks before your body, sort of chemistry starts changing to adapt to the altitude. Then, of course, you psychologically you've got to adapt, because no matter how much you imagine, what's ahead of you, when you actually get there, it is so much more, so much bigger, more difficult, more dangerous than you imagined. So we're getting there at the end of the monsoon. The mountain is blanketed in snow from the monsoon, and the whole of the sort of upper arena over the north, above the glacier, the Central Rongbuk Glacier on the north face of Everest, is heavily laden with snow and dropping avalanches all over the place. So you're looking and thinking, my God, this is just impossible. But of course, you've got to realise that the conditions are changing, because it's the end of the monsoon and autumn's coming. It'll get windy, some of the snow will blow away, some of it will fall off, and eventually, hopefully, it'll get safer. So, but the scale is just humongous. I mean, you have to get, before you even set foot on the mountain, like you start climbing with your hands and feet, you're already at 6,000 metres, which is higher than most of the other mountains in the world. And so, the difficulty only begins at that altitude, and when you first get to 6,000 metres, you feel at your end of your tether. You're breathless, you've got a slight headache, you might feel a bit nauseous because of the altitude, and you're totally listless. You just don't feel like, doing any physical effort. But you've got to push yourself to do it, because otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. But that does get easier over time. So there's a challenge that, you just got to keep positive, because it's going to get better. But also, of course, as you get higher, it gets harder. and then of course, there's the you can't make the final ascent of the mountain until conditions weather-wise are good. And back then we didn't have any information, no satellite phones. So, and the weather forecasts globally weren't as good as they are now. I mean, today you can sit in base camp and you can basically look on your smartphone at the weather reports produced in Switzerland for all the mountains of the world, and you can get a very accurate forecast of, up for 2 weeks of what the prediction would be. That back then, nothing. So you look at the sky and you wonder, is it going to? Start. We had a few false attempts because we set ourselves up on the mountain. We had a snow cave at 7,000 metres, a third of the way up the north face, And that was a sort of a stepping off point for our, final climb, hopefully to the summit. But we had a few false starts going all the way up to 7,000 metres, and the weather not cooperating, having to come back down again, going up again, having to come back down again. Eventually, we got to a stage where it felt, good, and we started making our final ascent.
Were you able to take in the experience, the scenery?
Oh, yeah,
or were you just too focused?
No. Of course you do. I mean, that's the whole reason you're there, from my perspective anyway. So all the time, even just when you first get to base camp, it's a shock seeing everything so big around you, but it is at the same time amazing, and that's what inspires you to keep going. And as you go higher, of course, it just gets more and more spectacular. So that's what really draws you on to wanting to know what it's like up higher.
So on October the 3rd, 1984, after 5 of you set out, just you and Greg Mortimer became the first Aussies to climb Mount Everest. That title must fill you with pride.
Yeah, it was a close run thing. As we left our snow cave at 7,000 metres, the first of us to drop off, Jeff Bartram, turned around. He thought, he would probably be getting cerebral edema. So before it got serious, he made the decision, a very unselfish one, to turn around while he could still do so on his own, because we had fixed ropes below that. So then there were 4 of us, and who went for another 2 days up. And we had a little tent at 8,100 metres, and leaving there for, we knew that day we'd either get to the summit or we'd have to abandon the trip. So the 4 of us set up from the tent having been woken at about 3 a.m. by my alarm. I didn't leave the tent till 8 o'clock. It takes that long to get going. It's really, really cold. That's one of the things, if you're not using oxygen, it makes handling that cold harder, and it was probably about minus 30 anyway. So, just extremely cold. And Lincoln Hall turned back at that point. He'd had frostbite in my first Himalayan expedition. He's the one who lost bits of his toes, and so he turned back there. And then there were 3 of us, and then basically all 3 of us nearly made it to the top, but Andy Henderson he stopped about half an hour short of the summit because he ran out of time. He was lagging behind a little bit. He'd broken his crampon earlier in the day. I don't know if that slowed him up much, but we tied it together with string. Actually, that's one setback I didn't talk about earlier on. We actually lost all of our climbing gear in the glacier. It got buried by spindrift, and we had to store on the glacier, which we'd left there for about maybe 5 days during a storm. And we came back to resume the climb. We dug around for the gear, but we couldn't find it. What we hadn't figured was the glacier had moved in that 5 or 6 days down the slope, probably 15, 20 metres. We didn't figure that. So if we were digging in a spot where our gear wasn't, it was like 15, 20 metres down the hill. Anyway, we lost all our climbing gear. Luckily, we were able to scratch replacement climbing gear together from spare bits and pieces that we had, and also the film crew, who had been equipped with quite good gear, were able to lend us theirs, because the idea was for them just to film from the bottom of the mountain. So they got in gear for walking around the glacier, which was climbing. It wasn't as good as what we'd lost, but we managed to cobble together enough gear for us to continue climbing. I ended up having to climb in my cross-country ski boots. But anyway, so it ended up, that's why Andy's crampons broke. They're an old pair. And he made it to within half an hour of the summit, but only Greg and I got to the top.
A Mount Everest historian, Walt Unsworth, described it as one of the greatest climbs ever done on the mountain.
Well, it's a huge accolade from the expert. Actually, Walt died a couple of weeks ago, sadly, but he was, he wrote the definitive book. So, it's quite a honour to have the climb described like that.
Was it also an honour to get an Order of Australia medal?
Yeah, I guess I feel I've still got to deserve it.
Now, upon reaching the summit, a chat with a mate at a pub inspired you to chase a new challenge. Can you tell us about that?
Well, did
he say summiting Everest is great and all, but you didn't really climb it if you didn't start at sea?
Yeah, that's right. Well, he said, it was a great climb you did, but of course you didn't you didn't climb it properly. And I said, well, what do you mean climb it properly? Like, how much more properly do you want me to climb it, without oxygen, new route, lightweight? He said, well, the mountain's measured from sea level. This guy's, his name was Mike Dillon. He was a filmmaker he was working for Channel 9. You'd have to climb it from sea level to do it properly. And I thought, well, that's just a gimmick, Mike, as if I'm going to go back and do that. But, I thought about it for a few months and thought, well, actually, it's the idea does have some merit, because I really like the wholeness of the concept. The problem with modern travel, as wonderful as it is, it diminishes the experience because it's so easy to get places now. And I always remember my father talking about travelling out from England to Africa, as he did on occasion. And in those days, they went by flying boat, and it would take like 5 days. And you'd stop even for lunch. You'd do flying down the Nile, so the flying boat lumbering along, and then come lunchtime, it'd sort of descend down to land on the Nile, refuel, and then the passengers would have lunch, then take off again. There was a stand-up bar on board, and of course, when night came, wouldn't fly at night, so they landed again and stayed in a comfortable hotel and so on. So, these days you get in a plane, you travel overnight, you arrive, overnight you arrive bleary-eyed and jet-lagged. So I thought, climbing the mountain from sea level would be a great journey. Walking through the Gangetic Plain, experiencing India at walking level. Walking is a great way of experiencing anywhere. It can be a bit boring sometimes if you say walking across a desert or just an unchanging landscape. But in a place like India, there's so much happening around you. It would be fascinating. And then, of course, going up through the foothills. So eventually I thought, well, yeah, maybe I should do it, because it would be a great experience. And I was always curious as to what it'd be like being on a mountain on your own, a big mountain. So rather foolishly, I thought maybe I should combine the Sea to Summit idea with climb the mountain alone. I say rather foolishly because I chose the wrong mountain to climb alone on, because even back then, that was 1990, there were quite a few other expeditions on the mountain. I mean, back in '84, when we arrived at base camp, there was no one else. A bit later, another expedition did turn up, but they were on another route, so we never saw anyone. But when I went there back in 1990 on the Sea to Summit trip, it was like 6 expeditions there.
Sorry, I was pretty engrossed in that. Let's talk about that second climb after the break. I'm Jo Hall, and you're listening to Great Australian Lives for Tobin Brothers Funerals, serving families across Victoria for over 80 years. I'm Jo Hall, and I'm joined tonight by my very special guest, mountaineer Tim Macartney-Snape. So in 1990, you once again set out for Everest and do it from sea level, Tim. Tell us about that experience.
Well, it's a very different.
How did
one.
it compare to 84?
Very different, because I was the only climber on the expedition. Because, again, to fund the expedition, and actually I do like communicating the experience. So I decided to do a documentary, and the guy whose idea it was Mike Dillon, was the cinematographer. Yeah, and so we had a small film crew, and basically it was just a simple, casual walk across the Gangetic Plain from the sea in the Bay of Bengal, south of Calcutta, and on up to Nepalese border. There are a few complications along the way. For instance, when I got to actually have to cross the river about 2 weeks into the walk, the route I'd chosen was following sort of minor roads, and the road came to the river and there was no bridge, and there were plenty of ferries but no bridge. Well, because I was doing it under my own steam, I thought taking a ferry kind of cheating, so I decided to swim across the river, which was an interesting experience, I must say. Hindus would hold that the water is pure of the Ganges, but I beg to differ. So I tried to keep my mouth shut. It was actually pretty well a 3-kilometre swim. And then when I got to the Nepalese border, I discovered that the Indian government had closed that border point to foreigners because they had some diplomatic stoush with Nepal. and that meant I had to go to another border crossing and do a 300-kilometre detour. In order to keep to my schedule, I needed to cover about 60 k's a day. So I jogged that for 5 days, and then eventually when I got to the mountain and started my climb, I was planning to do a traverse of the mountain. So I go up the West Ridge from base camp and down the southeast ridge to the South Col on the way down. But I had to change my plan because I went halfway up the West Ridge for acclimatisation, felt good about it, came down, and then there was a big snowfall, and it made me reconsider my plan because travelling alone with deep snow on avalanche-prone slopes, I thought, no, this is just not sensible. So I changed my plan to do the southeast ridge, which is not the normal route. And, eventually I had a bit of gastric sort of upset on my summit climb, but apart from that, all went according to plan and eventually got to the top again.
The gear you used during that adventure inspired you to create your own brand.
Yeah, well, I got a mate in Perth. I was living in WA at the time to make me a few bags. He had, had a little small company. And when I got back, I thought, well, what am I going to do now? And I thought, probably should use my expertise and notoriety to, because I like gear and I'm, uber critical about the gear that I use, and I'm always thinking about better ways that they could be made and so on. So I convinced my friend to start up we start a company call it Cedar Summit because that seemed like a natural and good name for an equipment brand. And I guess took about 10 years for it to gain traction. Now it's like 27 years down the track, and we have a very profitable global business now.
What are your thoughts on groups that help finance climbs to Everest? Are they dangerous?
Well, getting sponsorship is a danger because, then you have an obligation and you feel obligated to your sponsor, and then you've got to, it could press you into making the wrong decision. And I think it's really, really important for climbers to make their decisions based purely on the risk and not on expectations, which obviously can lead you to, taking on too much of a risk, or obligations to sponsors, which can also, there is such a thing as negative PR. Although I always think, I know a lot of climbers who've had epics because they've basically been negligent, and as a result, they became really, famous because they've stuffed up. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but no, I don't think it's worth risking any even a finger to frostbite just to climb a mountain. And that's one of the great challenges of mountaineering is to balance that the need to achieve and the risk associated with it.
So around 300 people have died trying to climb Everest. Do you think they would fall into that category that you've just described?
Look, I think, there are, most of them are accidents, but accidents aren't just accidents. They're a result of a chain of events, and almost always there are elements in that chain which were totally obvious and could have been avoided. And having said that, I could be the victim of accident, tomorrow. But you've always got to be vigilant. I think Everest is a special case though, because I think these days, since the commercialisation, the mass commercialisation of climbing it has occurred in the last 20 years, it's not really mountaineering anymore. The way most people climb Everest, it's mountain tourism. I think mountaineering always has to have an element of personal responsibility, self-care, self-organisation. But, it's like booking on a bus tour. If you book on a bus tour, you basically hand over the responsibility of all of the logistics, the travel arrangements, et cetera, to the tour company. And you don't really participate in the journey only in a visual sense. You don't actually play a part in the mechanics of the journey. And to me, that's, well, certainly one form of travel, but it's the least involved form of travel. It's the one that you're going to get less out of. So, and mountaineering to me is an experience where you make the decision to go. You're inspired to go to a mountain because of what it looks like, not because of what, it's the highest mountain or it's got some magical number, it's above 8,000 metres is totally arbitrary. So you've got to be, first of all, you've got to be inspired. You look at a mountain and say, wow, I'd love to climb that. That is, to me, that's a pure reason to want to climb a mountain, not I want to tell people at dinner party that I climb Mount Everest, or, I want to climb all the 8,000 metre peaks. That, to me, that is not a reason to go and climb a mountain. So that's the first thing. And then next, you go about planning your trip and you take responsibility for every step along the way so that you take total ownership of what you're doing. And, you get to a point where you think, well, is this too dangerous or not too dangerous? You don't have a guide making that choice for you because, and so when it comes to, doing a guided climb like that, you get well, the guides get as has happened in the past on a number of occasions, the guide feels a responsibility to take his client to the top because they paid for it. They may have even promised them, I'll get you to the top, don't worry, as has happened. And of course, conditions get bad, and it all falls apart, and the guide still feels obligated, and then is, tempted to make the wrong choice of decision, keep going, and it ends in grief. So I think there is a place for guiding in the mountains, but on Everest, it's gotten out of control. It's just, people basically now, if you've got the money, there's someone there who'll take you. And so there's no real system of testing people's experience, whether they've got enough experience or not. And, it all works out okay if conditions are perfect. But if they're not perfect, then, it all falls apart. And it's really bad PR for the mountain to have such unregulated numbers. There's no facilities for people. There's basic facilities at base camp. So there is rubbish removal. I think they've installed kind of toilets at base camp, but above base camp there's nothing. So all that waste just goes left on the mountain. I mean, some people remove their rubbish, and there's a government regulation to remove rubbish, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen completely anyway. So the mountain is trashed.
Such a shame, isn't it?
Well, it's a management problem. I mean, you wouldn't, in functional countries, I hope I'm not stepping out of a limb, but, like in Australia, for instance, a very popular walk is the Cradle Mountains Lake St Clair walk. Now, it's popular for a really good reason. It's beautiful, and, thousands of people walk it, but it's regulated. So you have to book on it. You have to book, and, and it's controlled, and the environment remains relatively pristine. Whereas on Everest, the numbers are really, everyone pays a fee to the government. So in theory, it's controlled, but it's not. Anyone can pay. And so the numbers, there's no cap on numbers where there used to be. Now, on a good season, you'll get on the mountain, and any particular day, you'll have up to 1,000 people. It's just ridiculous. And there's no facilities.
I'm Jo Hall, and I'm talking with mountaineer Tim Macartney-Snape, the first Aussie to conquer Mount Everest, on Great Australian Lives for Tobin Brothers Funerals, celebrating lives. More to come right after this. Welcome back to Great Australian Lives. I'm Jo Hall, and my special guest tonight is Tim Macartney-Snape. Tim, in the break we were talking about some movies made about climbing Mount Everest, and Everest is the one I've seen most recently. What are your thoughts on those movies?
They're pretty good. I mean, I think it was a shame, though, that they didn't get across the element of mountaineering which I think draws most people to them. That is the inspiration of being up there and the beauty of being in the mountains. There's too much emphasis on the challenge and proving yourself, all that sort of stuff, rather than the incredible, spectacular beauty of being up there.
You had a relationship with Fred Hollows, who was an avid climber himself. Tell us about Fred and the work you've done for his foundation.
Well, he's your classic. He's a Kiwi, but you could say he's a classic Kiwi Aussie who just got down and did stuff. He loved working with his hands, and I guess being an ophthalmologist, he'd, put that into practice by trying to cut all the bullshit, as you'd say, out of, the medical industry. And he'd go to places like Eritrea and Nepal and try and improve their health systems. And so I got involved with him early on with the program in Nepal. We started raising money for their indigenous program there, which was world-breaking, really. They would take out sort of camps to remote areas to do cataract surgery. And the great impediment to cataract surgery is the implanted lens. It was very expensive for Nepalese. And Fred had the idea that if the Nepalese made these lenses themselves, then they could provide them cheaply and make a profit out of selling them elsewhere. And eventually that happened. Now there's a internationally recognised intraocular lens factory in Kathmandu that sells lenses all around the world and also supplies countries like Nepal with cheap lenses. And the technologies that they've developed in Nepal now and the actual techniques are being taught to people all over the world.
Tell us about the books you've written.
Well, I wrote a book about being outside. It was actually called Being Outside, a manual for being outside comfortably. I wrote a Year 6 English book, and I wrote a book about my Everest expedition. I need to get back and write some more now. They're all out of print. They're probably out of date too.
It's clear what your greatest accomplishment is, but is there anything that you would have liked to have achieved?
Look, as I said, I don't feel I really earned my Order of Australia yet. So there's lots I'd like still to achieve.
What are some of those things?
Well, a mate of mine came up with a very interesting and I think true explanation for human nature, but it's paradigm shifting, and like all paradigm shifts, it'll ruffle a lot of feathers because it really explains the origins of human nature and explains actually that we're fundamentally good rather than bad as a species. We have actually a heritage of coming from one that's perfectly loving and cooperative. That is our ancestral primate past, and the human condition basically is our conscious brain, which inevitably was a result of this very cooperational past. We're the only animal that's fully conscious. It's at loggerheads with our instinctive self, our soul, if you like. And the only scientific understanding of that process can heal that rift. So, humans are fundamentally good. You don't have to actually go and climb Everest to prove yourself you're good. I mean, fundamentally, I think all people have this insecurity that they haven't been loved enough, and that's just the human condition. But the knowledge that we're all good, actually based in fact, is very relieving, but it's also confronting to look at that.
Do you have any regrets?
Yeah, I do. I wish I didn't have that extra drink last night. No. No, not really. I mean, you can't look back. I mean, you can look back if you like, but I don't think it's that instructive to dwell on the past. So you learn from your mistakes and move on. I think it's unfair that life's so short.
It is, isn't it? Damn unfair. Would you encourage young people to be as bold as you in terms of adventure?
I would, but I think I'd also encourage people to think twice before you do anything. Do your homework. I guess I'm a bit impulsive sometimes. I'm, optimistic, maybe overly optimistic, but just stop, think about it a bit, and move on.
Tim, thank you for coming on the program. I found our chat fascinating, and I'm sure, like me, our listeners would be in awe of what you've achieved so far in life.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm Jo Hall. Join me again next Sunday night from 8 right here on 3